Hola, Team Bio. Welcome back from spring break. Okay, so we're going to jump right into our study of DNA, or expanded long form, also known as deoxyribonucleic acid. So the D comes from the deoxy, the N, nucleic, and the A, the acid part of deoxyribonucleic acid. Okay, so what is DNA? Remember, all the way back into, the far depths of the fall term, we talked about the big four. And we had carbs, fats and lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And we spent a good amount of time in the fall talking about these three. We talked about glucose and fructose and how they came together to make sucrose. We talked a lot about cellulose, so the function of carbohydrates being primarily short-term energy storage as well as structural, sometimes as signaling molecules. Fats and lipids, we talked about long-term energy storage of fats and also how they make up membranes. So they're the polar nature of the phospholipid head and the nonpolar nature of the tail created that double lipid bilayer, which allows the cell to control what crosses the bilayer. And then we talked about protein. Its primary, it has a bunch of different functions, but primarily structural, as well as the enzymatic function of protein. And remember, the structure of protein was integral to its function. So when it lost its three-dimensional shape, either due to heat or acid or high salt concentration, we saw that proteins fell apart. Okay, so brief overview of the big four. The big role of nucleic acid in the body is to store genetic material. So DNA is the carrier of genetic information. And all living organisms have DNA and RNA. We'll be talking more about the differences between DNA and RNA coming up, I think, next week. But they both play a critical role in the central dogma of biology, which is DNA, the carrier of genetic information, is transcribed transcription into RNA, ribonucleic acid, which is then translated into protein. And the proteins that are created basically control all characteristics and behaviors. Oops. What else do I want to say about the central dogma? Okay, so later on in this term, you've already actually briefly studied transcription and translation. It was that really frustrating day where I was not in class, and I had you do a screen capture, I think, or this thing that I'm doing right now. What is this called? screencast. I had you create a little screencast, and you struggled mightily. But we'll rewatch those, and hopefully they'll be helpful in refreshing your memory as to what transcription and translation are. But we're going to go through these processes in great detail this spring. So it all starts with the DNA. The DNA holds the information that's later going to be created into protein, and protein is going to be what carries out all the biological functions of any cell. Okay, so I'm going to throw up here another image that you've seen before, which is this guy. This, remember, is our phylogenetic tree of life. And it shows you relationships between, evolutionary relationships between all the different living organisms. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to move it over. Oh, shoot. And so, remember right down here, this is the root, this is the beginning of life. Oops. And every tip is a modern day organism, so these are all modern day organisms here. Okay, and remember we had two big groups of organisms. Or I guess one more thing I want to say before I jump into the next thing is that if you look at the way this phylogenetic tree is created, you'll notice that all these modern day species that we see, well, this is an ancient species, but all these guys, modern day species out here at the tip, they all share a common ancestor all the way down here. And we actually see this in the genetic code. We all share pieces of our genetic code, even with, bacteria that are all the way over here on a phylogenetic tree. And so we can trace our evolutionary history based on how much of our DNA sequence is similar to another organism. So for example, between humans, we share 99.99% of the same DNA. So if you look out at anyone in our class, you share 99.99% of the same genetic code. A chimpanzee and you share 98% of the same genetic code. Organisms that are even more distantly related to you share less. But we all share some. So this is giving evidence to the fact that all life is interconnected and related. Okay, so, but that's not really what I wanted to talk about. Okay, I wanted to use this picture to transition to the next piece, which is DNA organization. So remember from when we talked about this picture, there were two big groups of organisms. We called all the organisms that were in this part of the tree prokaryotes. And we called all the organisms that were in this section of the tree eukaryotes. Remember, eu meaning true, karyon meaning kernel, and this is a reference to the nucleus. So all organisms in this area of the tree have a nucleus, whereas before karyon, before nucleus, all the organisms in this section of the tree do not have a true nucleus. remember, the nucleus is where the DNA is stored inside of a eukaryotic cell. But in a prokaryotic cell, it's stored like so. If here we have a little prokaryotic cell, all the DNA is one big loop, and it's just random, all squished into the whole cell like this. It spreads out throughout the cell. It's called the nucleoid region, the area that the DNA inhabits, but the DNA is kind of everywhere in a prokaryotic cell, and it's one big loop. If you were to take this DNA and pull it out of the cell and look at it and unravel it, it would just look like a singular loop like this. Okay. However, a eukaryote looks a little different. It is much bigger, first of all, and it contains a nucleus, like so. And the nucleus is full of segments of DNA. Unlike a prokaryote, which has a looped piece of DNA, eukaryotes have lots of little chains of DNA that are linear. They're not looped. And these are called chromosomes. Now, let's say this cell is a human cell. There would be 46 chromosomes total. 23 pairs. Oops, I just said 22, but I meant 23. So, chromosomes of diploid organisms, which is the type of organism we are, a diploid, meaning we have 2 copies of every chromosome. Why do we have 2 copies of every chromosome? Well, we get one from our mother and one from our father. So if I were to zoom in and look at this nucleus, this would be the chromosome number 1 that came from your mom. This would be chromosome number 1 that came from your dad. This would be chromosome number 2 that came from your mom, chromosome 2 that came from your dad. So all of our chromosomes and all of our somatic cells come in pairs. Okay. What else do I want to talk about here? Class. Oh, right. Okay. So back to this little bacteria guy, this little prokaryote. He's got this one big looped piece of DNA in the nucleoid region. But in addition to that, there are all these tiny little looped pieces of DNA. Oh, I can't get this any smaller. That are just tiny little loops. Let's see. If I select it, can I shrink it down? Yeah. And then copy it and paste. Okay, so these tiny little loops of DNA are going to be clustered throughout the bacteria cell, and these are called plasmids. And they're small satellite pieces of DNA. And they are important for a couple different reasons. We'll talk about them when we talk about biotechnology and bioengineering, because sometimes you can put a piece of DNA, if you want a bacterial cell to make, for example, a human protein, you can put the gene on a plasmid, put it into a bacteria, that's called to transfect it into bacteria, and then get the bacteria to make the protein for you. These are also important because sometimes they can confer antibiotic resistance to bacteria. So that's not so good for medicine. Okay, I think this is a kind of distracted and fragmented. Oh no. Screencast, but I think that's all I want to tell you about in our introduction to DNA here. Okay, welcome back, and I will see you all on Wednesday or Thursday, depending on what section you're in.